Okay. The question that you raised about the relationship between the Black Freedom Movement and the white student movement or the white militant youth movement. I came of age at a moment, and I think there's lessons. I don't know. Lessons is the wrong word because I don't have any answers. For the complicated issues are complicated. That's all you can say. I think listening to old people talk about what we learned is had a short shelf life, and I'm not for it. So I don't have any answers. But I do think that there's, again, kind of mirrors here around cooperation or non-cooperation between Israeli radicals and the Palestinian movements of various sorts. At the moment, by 67 and 68, most of the Black freedom organizations, not all, in the United States, certainly the militant Black freedom organizations, had decided that white people should leave their organizations and go organize white people. That was a depressing moment for white people who didn't want to leave those organizations and who didn't want to have to go only talk to white people. But it also was a strategy that was real, and it made some sense, even though I think as a long-term question, it's got a lot of problems in it, that kind of separation and identity nationalism. But it was compelling, and it was a given in our framework. And so the Panthers had what they called white mother country radical allies, and we were among those allies, which doesn't mean that we weren't being criticized at the same time. But other organizations were really organized around a black nationalist framework, and others were organized around worker frameworks. But by and large, there was a period of about almost 10 years, really, of separation by race. And a few organizations survived without it, but not a lot. So what you saw in the film was actually Fred Hampton from the Black Panther Party in Chicago, young, brilliant, a 21-year-old guy, just turned 21, out of Maywood, Illinois, who was exactly the FBI's greatest fear, right? A charismatic black leader. And he was assassinated exactly 40 years ago on December 4th, 1969, a few doors down from the Students for Democratic Society, SDS National Office in Chicago. There's a wonderful new book about it. One of my comrades in law school was his lawyer, had just started a legal collective called the People's Law Office, and they represented him as he was being arrested. But PLO, exactly. There's a PLO in Chicago, a PLO office in Chicago with a great history, but it's the People's Law Office. And it took Jeff Haas, who wrote the book, The Assassination of Fred Hampton, another 8 years to prove that it was the Chicago Police Department and the FBI who plotted to assassinate him, who drugged him, who had an informant inside the Panthers, who drugged him that night so that when 300 bullets came in from the police department, he never was even lifted his head off the bed before he was assassinated. And so was Mark Clark. 2 Panthers were assassinated and several were wounded. So he retells that story right now as a legal thriller. So what you see, the clip in the movie, on the Weather Underground movie, shows Fred, angry at what he calls Custeristic actions, from General Custer, kind of suicidal, interestingly enough, actions. And he, to tell you the truth, some days he said that, and then the next day he was all for it. So he was concerned that our growing militants that the people who would pay the heaviest price for it was the black population of Chicago. And that was a valid concern, and we thought it was a valid concern. So, on the other hand, some days he loved it, and the bigger the mess, the better. He thought was part of our job around to bring the war home. PLO and weather. We wrote a book. I was underground for 11 years. I was on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list for most of that decade. We published a book called Prairie Fire, named after. Do you know prairie? Do you know what a prairie is?
Of grass.
Yeah, the long Midwest. But it really comes from Mao. It comes from a single spark can start a prairie fire. a quote from Mao. But it was also about our Midwest kind of heartland of America origins. And in that book we published from Underground, there's a chapter on the Palestinian struggle. So this was written probably in 1973, 74. And, if you read it now, it's got a few problems, but it's pretty good. It's not too bad. We had our eye on the Palestinian struggle by then. We had a kind of a principled position that we did not travel outside the United States when we were fugitives. We did not have direct contact with anybody else, although there's lots of books published saying that there was a big conspiracy between all the various fractions in Europe, activists in Europe, and us and the Palestinians. But it was only a solidarity principle. Violent struggle. That, I can't answer that in a minute or two. I think people have a right to resist oppression, and certainly people who are under occupation have an absolute right to resist oppression. And what's violent when it's done by people without an air force, is not considered violent if you're a nation state, if you're the United States, using drones to bomb populated cities in Pakistan. So I think that the whole conversation about who gets to characterize what's violent has to be unpacked in order to have a sensible conversation. So I think, the conditions of occupation are violent by definition. Slavery in the United States was violent by definition. It was an ongoing, permanent form of violence. On the other hand, and I'm hoping this isn't just an old woman kind of thing, but it might be. On the other hand, I think that we talked much too flippantly about war. We romanticized war. There is nothing, you don't want war. You just don't want war. It's horrible. The people who die are almost always now women and children. 80% of the casualties of war. And I think, what can you say? It's a last resort. But that means everything has to go in front of it. For it to be a last resort, there has to be lots of other resorts. So I'm not for it. How can you be for it? And yet we live in a state of total violence. And so to be silent in the face of that violence is unacceptable. And I think the kind of things that we just saw from Edo is impressive, because they're organizing, they're cultural, they're activists, they're artistic, and then it includes some property violence, as far as I can tell. And we always try to distinguish between property violence and violence against people. It's partly a privilege of living inside the United States, but I think that was the Weather Underground's defining characteristic. I feel like we were lucky in that regard, that we pulled back from the brink of some kind of actions that were contemplated that were really attacks on civilian population. And while it's easy to say in a situation like Israel or the United States that people are complicit, that everyone is complicit, that everyone knows, and that everyone's benefiting from somebody else's subjugation and oppression and tyranny, all true, and yet, and yet, it's our job to organize opposition inside that oppressor country. Organize with ideas and with moral force. So drawing lines, I don't know how to do it. It's a mystery.
Great.